The wind was a constant thief on the plains, stealing warmth from the skin and words from the mouth. Alara felt it now, a cold hand pressing against the thin clapboard of the house, rattling the window panes in their loose frames. It was a sound she had known her entire life, the lonely song of the vast, unforgiving land. But tonight it sounded like a dirge. Inside, the only light came from a single kerosene lamp, its flame shivering in the drafts, casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar shapes into monstrous things. The air was thick with the scent of dust, dried herbs, and the cloying sweetness of sickness. Her husband, Silas, lay in their bed, a ruin of the man he had once been. His breath was a shallow, ragged thing, a counterpoint to the howling gale outside. The despair in the room was so dense it felt like another presence, sitting in the corner, waiting. Alara's gaze was fixed on his arm, where a web of old scars crisscrossed the sun-darkened skin. A farming life was written there in silvered lines. A runaway plow, a tangled barbed wire fence, the kick of a panicked mule. They were marks of survival, badges of a hard-won existence. But now, they were the source of a new and unspeakable terror. "It's moving again," Silas rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. His eyes, sunken and clouded with fever, were wide with a horror that transcended pain. Alara leaned closer, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She watched, her own breath held captive. And then she saw it, a faint, sickening ripple beneath the largest scar on his forearm. It was not a muscle twitch, not a tremor from the fever. It was a slow, deliberate undulation, a current of something alien flowing just under the surface of his skin. It looked, impossibly, as if death itself were a physical thing, a worm burrowing patiently through the channels of his old wounds, mapping his body for the grave. The first time he had mentioned it, weeks ago, she had dismissed it as fever dreams, a phantom of his growing delirium. She had brewed willow bark tea and prayed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. But she could not deny the evidence of her own eyes. The movement grew more distinct with each passing day, a subtle tide that ebbed and flowed beneath his flesh. The healer from the next county, a woman with eyes like dried corn husks, had taken one look, muttered of curses and bad blood, and left without even accepting payment. The whispers followed, carried on the same wind that scoured their land. The Brandons, who shared their property line, no longer met her gaze. Their children herded inside whenever she drew water from the well. They were isolated, adrift in a sea of grass and suspicion, with a horror that had no name. Alara smoothed a cool, damp cloth over Silas's brow, her touch a desperate anchor in a world that had come unmoored. The thing under his skin pulsed, a slow, steady rhythm that mocked his failing heart. The stakes were no longer about a harvest or a harsh winter. They were etched in the terrifying, silent crawl of the unknown. Fear was a taste in her mouth, metallic and bitter as blighted grain. She had to do something. The herbs were failing. The prayers felt like hollow echoes in the vast, empty sky. There was one last option, a name spoken in town with a mixture of contempt and fear. Finch. A doctor, they called him. A man from the East with strange instruments and godless ideas, who had set up a practice in a small office behind the mercantile. To go to him would be to admit defeat, to turn her back on the familiar ways and embrace the foreign and the suspect. But as she watched the slow, inexorable creep beneath her husband's scars, she knew that the familiar ways were already failing. The horror in her home was far greater than any fear of a stranger. The lamp flame guttered, and in the momentary darkness, the only thing she could feel was the terrifying, silent movement and the chilling certainty that if she did nothing, she would soon be utterly and completely alone. The wind howled its agreement, a mournful cry across the endless, empty land. She would go. She would face the town, and she would face the strange doctor. She had to. For Silas, she would walk into any shadow, no matter how deep. The next dawn broke gray and grudging, the sun a pale wafer behind a scrim of high, thin clouds. Alara left Silas sleeping a fitful, feverish sleep, a jug of water and a small loaf of bread by his side. The decision, made in the terrifying dark of the previous night, felt fragile in the morning light, a thing easily broken by doubt. She harnessed the old mare, her movements stiff and clumsy with exhaustion and dread. The wagon wheels groaned in protest as they began the long, slow roll toward town, a journey she had not made in months. The prairie stretched out on all sides, a monotonous ocean of brown, dormant grass under a sky the color of slate. It was a landscape that offered no comfort, its vastness serving only to magnify her own smallness, her own desperate solitude. Every creak of the wagon, every gust of wind, seemed to whisper the community's judgment. She's going to him, the godless man, the butcher. Her hands, raw from lye soap and farm work, tightened on the worn leather reins. Let them whisper. Their whispers could not make Silas well. Their averted eyes could not halt the sickening crawl beneath his skin. The town of Providence rose from the plains not as a beacon, but as a scar of raw lumber and muddy tracks. It was a place of necessity, not welcome. As she guided the mare down the main street, the silence that fell was louder than any condemnation. Faces turned in windows. Men paused, their conversations dying on their lips. She was the wife of the cursed man, a pariah by association. Alara kept her gaze fixed forward, her spine straight, drawing on a reserve of pride she hadn't known she possessed. She felt like a ghost, already mourned and forgotten. She found the doctor's office tucked away in an alley, a freshly painted sign. Dr. Alistair Finch, the only clean thing on the street. The door was a stark, unadorned plank of wood. For a long moment, she could not bring herself to raise her hand. This was the threshold. Crossing it meant abandoning all she knew, placing her faith not in God or tradition, but in a man. Finally, her knuckles rapped against the wood, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet alley. The door opened. The man who stood before her was not the monster of town gossip. He was tall and spare, with hair the color of sand and eyes of a startling, intelligent gray. He was younger than she'd expected, and there was a stillness about him, a deep-seated quiet that was unnerving. He wore a clean, collarless shirt, and his hands, though long-fingered and pale, looked capable. He simply waited, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes taking in her worn dress, her wind-chapped face, the desperation she knew must be plain to see. Her voice was a stranger to her own ears, thin and reedy. I am Alara Miller. My husband, Silas. He is unwell. The understatement was absurd. A tiny pebble thrown against a mountain of horror. The doctor, this Alistair Finch, did not speak immediately. He just watched her, and in his gaze, she saw not judgment or pity, but a keen, analytical curiosity. It was the look of a man who sees not a pariah, but a problem to be solved. Come in, he said, his voice as quiet and steady as his gaze. He stepped back, holding the door open. As Alara crossed the threshold from the muddy alley into the clean, antiseptic-smelling office, she felt a profound and terrifying shift, as if she had just stepped out of her own life and into another. The doctor's office was a world unto itself. Unlike the cluttered, dusty interiors of every other building in Providence, this room was spare, ordered, and unervingly bright. Sunlight, unfiltered by grimy panes or heavy curtains, streamed through a tall, clean window, illuminating the motes of dust her own entrance had disturbed. The air smelled sharply of carbolic acid and alcohol, a sterile scent that scoured the familiar farm smells from her clothes. On a set of neat wooden shelves stood rows of glass bottles filled with colored liquids and white powders, each meticulously labeled with a script she could not read. A human skeleton, stark white and grinning, stood in one corner, a silent, macabre sentinel. Alara averted her eyes, a fresh wave of unease washing over her. This was a place of science, a place that sought to dismantle the mysteries she had been taught only to fear and respect. Felt like a violation. Dr. Finch gestured to a simple wooden chair. Please, he moved with an economy of motion, closing the door and walking to a small desk where a large, leather-bound book lay open. He did not sit, but stood beside it, his attention fully on her. "Tell me about your husband," he said. The words were a simple command, yet they felt immense. How could she describe the indescribable? How could she put the language of nightmares into the rational light of this room? "He has a fever," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "A deep weakness. He cannot keep food down. And there are pains," she faltered, her gaze dropping to her own hands, twisting in her lap. "But that is not the worst of it." She looked up, meeting his steady, gray eyes. "There are old scars on his arms, from his work, and beneath them, something moves." The confession hung in the sterile air, sounding even more insane here than it had in the shadowed gloom of her own home. She braced herself for disbelief, for the polite dismissal of a man who believed only in what his books and instruments told him. But Dr. Finch's expression did not change. He merely picked up a pen, dipped it in an inkwell, and made a note in his ledger. "Moves how?" he asked, his tone even clinical. "Like a current," she struggled to explain, her hands fluttering in a useless gesture. "A slow crawling, under the skin. You can see it." He made another note. "When did this begin?" "Weeks ago. Faintly at first. Now, it is constant." He asked more questions, his inquiries precise and detached. About Silas's diet, his work, the water from their well, the date the fever first appeared. He was like a cartographer, mapping the landscape of her husband's illness, seeking a pattern where she saw only chaos and terror. There was no talk of curses, no mention of sin or divine punishment. He spoke of symptoms and timelines, of contagion and pathology. It was a language she did not understand, but it was a language of action, not of passive fear. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of something other than despair. It was not yet hope, but it was a quietening of the panic, a sense that the horror was being looked at, measured, and therefore might not be infinite. "I will need to see him," he said finally, laying his pen down. The statement was simple, matter-of-fact. He would come to their blighted farm. He would step into the room where the whispers of the community had coalesced into a tangible dread. "The roads are poor," she warned, the practicalities a sudden, grounding concern. "I have a sturdy horse," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I will follow you. Tomorrow, at first light." Elara could only nod, a knot of emotion tightening in her throat. He was coming. The man of science was coming to her house of shadows. She did not know if he was a savior or simply a new kind of fool, but he was coming. And that, for now, was everything. True to his word, Dr. Finch arrived as the first rays of sun bled across the eastern horizon, his dark buggy a stark silhouette against the pale sky. Elara had been awake for hours, cleaning the small house with a frantic energy, as if she could scrub away the sickness itself. She had aired the bedding, swept the floor, and even polished the tarnished silver locket she wore, a nervous, futile gesture of respectability. Seeing his buggy crest the rise, her heart began a frantic, uneven rhythm. His presence made the farm feel different, suddenly seen and judged. The peeling paint on the porch, the broken fence post near the barn, the general air of neglect born of Silas's long illness. It all seemed to declare their failure to this quiet, observant man. He tethered his horse and approached the house, carrying a black leather bag that looked heavy with purpose. He gave a slight nod as she held the door open, his gray eyes sweeping over the interior of the cabin in a single, comprehensive glance before settling on the bed in the corner. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The air, once thick only with Elara's private fear, was now charged with a new tension. The collision of the old world and the new. Dr. Finch set his bag down on the small kitchen table and approached the bed. Silas, roused by the unfamiliar presence, stared at the doctor with fever-bright, distrustful eyes. "Silas," Elara said softly, "this is Dr. Finch." "He's come to help." Silas gave a weak, dismissive grunt, his gaze flickering to the doctor's clean hands and foreign instruments as if they were weapons. Dr. Finch paid his hostility no mind. He spoke to Silas in a low, calm voice, explaining what he was doing as he did it. He took his pulse, his fingers gentle but firm on Silas's wrist. He listened to his breathing with a cold, metal stethoscope that made Silas flinch. He examined his eyes, his tongue, the pallor of his skin. The entire process was methodical, unhurried, a stark contrast to the frantic, whispered rituals of the folk healer. Alara stood by the hearth, her hands clasped, watching every movement. She was caught between two worlds, the instinct to trust this man's calm competence, and the deep-seated, superstitious fear that his probing and prodding were a kind of sacrilege. Then came the moment she had been dreading. "Show me the scars," Dr. Finch said, his voice quiet. Alara moved to the bedside and gently pulled back the sheet and the sleeve of Silas's nightshirt, exposing his forearm. In the clear morning light, the sight was even more disturbing. The skin was inflamed, and beneath the largest, thickest scar, a slow, rhythmic pulse was clearly visible, a repulsive life within a life. Silas groaned, a sound of both pain and shame. Dr. Finch leaned in close, his expression unchanged. There was no gasp of horror, no flicker of fear. He observed the phenomenon with the same dispassionate intensity with which he had examined the bottles in his office. He pressed a finger gently against the skin beside the scar. The movement under the surface seemed to recoil, to retreat from his touch. He did it again on the other side, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not repulsed. He was intrigued. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to them. The word, so utterly devoid of emotion, was both a comfort and a profound shock. To him, this horror was not a curse to be feared, but a puzzle to be solved. He opened his black bag and removed a small magnifying glass and a notebook, beginning to sketch the pattern of the scars and the area of the movement. He was a scientist in the face of a monster, and Alara found herself clinging to his strange, cold courage as if it were a torch in the dark. The days that followed fell into a new, strange rhythm, marked by the doctor's visits. He would arrive in the late afternoon, after his rounds in town, his buggy a familiar sight now on the dusty track leading to their farm. He never stayed long, but his presence lingered, a quiet challenge to the despair that had taken root in the house. He brought tinctures in small brown bottles, digitalis for the heart, laudanum for the pain, but he made no promises of a cure. "This is to manage the symptoms," he explained, his voice low and serious, "to give him strength. The cause is what we must find." He would sit by Silas's bed for an hour at a time, simply observing. He recorded the frequency and direction of the subcutaneous movement, the fluctuations in his fever, the clarity of his mind. He filled pages of his notebook with his neat, precise script. His prolonged silence was unnerving at first, but Alara began to understand it. He was not ignoring them. He was listening to the illness itself, letting it tell its own story. A silent partnership began to form between them. She would have a pot of coffee ready when he arrived, and they would sit at the small kitchen table, the patient's bed a few feet away, and speak in low tones. He asked her about the farm, about the land. Had they cleared any new fields? Had Silas been bitten by anything unusual in the past years? He wanted to know the history of the scars themselves. "The big one," she recounted, her voice distant with memory, "was from a piece of old machinery, a thresher we bought at auction. It was rusted through. The metal tore him open. From wrist to elbow, Dr. Finch listened intently, his gray eyes fixed on her face. Was there anything unusual about the machine? Where did it come from?" She shook her head. "Just an old farm abandoned, over by the Blackwood Marsh. People say the ground there is sour," he made a note. Blackwood Marsh. She watched him work, and the fear she held of him slowly, imperceptibly, began to dissolve, replaced by a grudging respect. She saw the way he gently cleaned Silas's arm, his touch careful and sure. She saw the deep concentration in his eyes as he held a sample of their well water up to the light. He was not a cold, godless man. He was a man driven by a profound, almost holy sense of purpose. He was at war with ignorance, at war with death, and his weapons were observation and reason. One evening, As a storm gathered on the horizon, he was late. The wind rose, and the old anxieties began to creep back in. When his buggy finally appeared through the sheeting rain, a wave of relief washed over her that was so powerful it startled her. He entered, dripping, and she handed him a towel without a word. He accepted it, and their eyes met for a moment over the rough-spun cloth. In that look, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were allies now, two solitary figures standing together against the encroaching darkness. He was no longer just the doctor, and she was no longer just the patient's wife. They were partners in a desperate vigil, bound by the terrible mystery that lay pulsing in the next room. The turning point came not from a medical text or a scientific instrument, but from a half-forgotten memory dredged up from the depths of Silas's fever. Dr. Finch was there, charting the slow, rhythmic crawl on his forearm, which now seemed more active than ever. The doctor, in his quiet, persistent way, was asking about the day of the accident, the one that had left the largest scar. "The thresher?" Silas murmured, his eyes glassy but, for a moment, lucid. "It was tangled, full of black vines. Tough as wire," he coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Had to pull them out with my bare hands to get the gears to turn. They were slimy. Left a black stain on my skin." Alara and Dr. Finch exchanged a look. "Black vines?" the doctor pressed gently. "In the machine?" Silas nodded, his energy fading. "From the marsh. The whole thing was sunk in the muck. We had to drag it out with the team. The vines were growing all through it. Like veins." His eyes fluttered closed, his brief moment of clarity gone, leaving his words hanging in the tense silence of the room. "Blackwood Marsh," Dr. Finch said, his voice taut with sudden focus. He stood up and began to pace the small space between the hearth and the door, a caged energy about him that Alara had never seen before. A fungal growth, perhaps. Something in the soil, in the water. Something that entered the wound. He stopped and looked at Alara, his gray eyes alight with a fierce, intellectual fire. The latency could have lain dormant for years, in the scar tissue, encapsulated, waiting for the right conditions. A weakening of his system, the fever, to begin to spread. It was a theory, spoken into the air, but it felt like the first solid thing Alara had been able to grasp in months. It was not a curse. It was not a demon. It was a vine, a thing from the earth, a tangible enemy. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. The supernatural horror began to recede, replaced by a biological one. Awful, yes, but something that could potentially be understood. Something that could be fought. The doctor's new theory, however, did not sit well with the world outside their cabin. Their isolation was about to be breached. The following Sunday, as if summoned by the change in the atmosphere, a delegation from the town arrived. It was led by Reverend Thorne, a man whose piety was as rigid and unyielding as the hard winter ground. With him were two of the town's elders, their faces grim and set. They did not knock. The Reverend simply pushed the door open and stepped inside, his shadow falling across the floor like a judgment. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice booming in the small space, ignoring Dr. Finch completely. "We have come out of Christian concern. Your husband's affliction is a blight on this community. There is talk of unnaturalness here. We have come to pray over him, to cleanse this house." Alara's blood ran cold. Cleanse. The word was a threat, cloaked in scripture. She saw the furtive glances the men cast at Dr. Finch, at his bag of instruments, at the strange, sterile order he had brought to this corner of the room. He was the unnaturalness they spoke of. She stood, placing herself between the townsman and Silas's bed. "My husband is under a doctor's care." Reverend, the words were quiet, but they were firm. It was the first time she had ever contradicted him. The Reverend's eyes narrowed. "You have put your faith in this man? A man who traffics in dissection and godless theories? This is a matter for the soul, not the flesh." Dr. Finch stepped forward, his calm a stark contrast to the Reverend's righteous fury. "With all due respect, Reverend, the soul is best served when the body is not in torment. I am trying to alleviate that torment." "By what means?" one of the elders sneered. By inviting darkness into this home? The confrontation crackled in the air, a standoff between faith and reason, superstition and science. And Alara, to her own astonishment, found herself standing firmly on the side of science. "He is not leaving," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. "And you are not welcome here if you come only to cast judgment. My husband needs a healer, not an exorcist." The Reverend stared at her, his face a mask of shocked indignation. He had expected a grieving, compliant widow in waiting. He found instead a guardian. After a moment of stunned silence, he turned on his heel. "May God have mercy on this house," he declared, a curse disguised as a blessing. "For you have turned your back on him." The men followed him out, leaving the door gaping open to the cold wind. Alara stood her ground, trembling but resolute, until their wagon was a speck on the horizon. Then she slowly closed the door, shutting out their world, and sealing herself inside with her husband, her doctor, and the terrible, tangible truth they were beginning to uncover. The departure of the Reverend and his elders left a vacuum in the small cabin, the charged air slowly settling. The confrontation had been a crucible, and Alara felt its transformative heat still radiating through her. She had not bent. She had not broken. She looked at Dr. Finch, who was watching her with an expression of quiet, profound respect. The shared battle had forged their alliance into something stronger, something unbreakable. "Thank you," he said simply. The two words were freighted with meaning, an acknowledgement of the risk she had taken, the social exile she had just cemented for herself. She merely nodded, her throat too tight for words. The external threat had passed, for now, leaving them alone once more with the internal one. The doctor turned his attention back to Silas, his focus sharpened by the interruption. The theory of the marsh, the vines, the contaminated wound, it consumed him. "It's a parasite," he murmured, thinking aloud. "Or a fungus. Something that mimics the body's own vascular system, spreading through the path of least resistance, the scar tissue. The movement, it's not locomotion, it's growth. A slow, cellular expansion." He opened his black bag, his movements now filled with a new urgency. "I can't be certain." Not just by looking. He paused, and the air grew heavy again, but with a different kind of dread. It was the weight of a difficult, necessary question. "Alara," he said, using her first name for the first time. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were intense. "To know what this is, to have any chance of fighting it, I need to see it. I need a sample." She knew what he was asking. The implication was terrifying, a violation of the body that went against every instinct. He wanted to cut into her husband, to open the wound that had been the source of so much pain and create a new one. All her life, she had been taught that the body was sacred, its interior a mystery best left to God. The Reverend's accusations of butchery echoed in her mind. But then she looked at Silas, his skin stretched taut over the alien thing that was slowly consuming him from within. What was the greater violation? A small, precise incision made in the name of healing, or this slow, parasitic conquest? "It's the only way," Dr. Finch said, seeing the war in her eyes. "I must have a biopsy, a small piece of the tissue from the margin of the scar, to examine under my microscope, his microscope, another piece of his strange, foreign world. A tool that could see what the naked eye could not." It was the ultimate test of faith, not in a deity, but in this man and his methods. She looked from the doctor's earnest, steady face to her husband's tormented one. The choice was clear. The path of fear had led them here, to this precipice. The only way forward was to leap. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice a whisper, but the whisper was an assent. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over the doctor's features. "Boiling water," he said, his voice instantly becoming crisp and professional. "The cleanest linen you have, and all the light you can give me." The decision was made. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange bars across the floor. They would not wait for morning. The battle would be joined tonight. As Alara moved to the stove to stoke the fire, She felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with purpose. She was no longer a passive victim of fate. She was an active participant in the fight for her husband's life. The cabin transformed into a makeshift operating theater. Alara stoked the fire until the stove roared, placing the largest kettle on to boil. She brought out the fine linen sheets from her wedding chest, cloths that had not seen the light of day in years, and began tearing them into sterile strips as the doctor instructed. He, in turn, laid out his instruments on a clean towel on the kitchen table. A gleaming silver scalpel, forceps, needles, and a series of small glass slides. He washed his hands with a practiced, methodical rigor, scrubbing them with carbolic soap until they were raw. The lamplight glinted off the polished steel, turning the familiar, rustic cabin into a place of stark and terrifying potential. Silas was drifting in a shallow, laudanum-induced sleep, his breathing soft and even. "It's better this way," Dr. Finch said quietly, seeing her anxious glance. "He will feel less." Alara brought 2 more lamps to the bedside, positioning them until the scarred forearm was bathed in a pool of bright, unwavering light. Every detail was thrown into sharp relief. The puckered, silvery lines of the old wounds, the faint, reddish inflammation of the skin, and the subtle, horrifying pulse of the thing beneath. Dr. Finch took a deep breath, a final, centering moment before the irrevocable act. "Are you ready?" he asked Alara. He was not asking for permission anymore. He was asking if she had the strength to witness this. She moved to the head of the bed, placing a hand on Silas's shoulder, a silent promise of her presence. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the doctor's hands. He picked up the scalpel. The silver blade hovered over Silas's arm for a heartbeat, a moment stretched into an eternity. Then, with a smooth, decisive motion, he made a small, shallow incision, no more than an inch long, parallel to the main scar. Alara flinched, a sympathetic sting sharp in her own arm. A line of dark blood welled up instantly. The doctor ignored it, his focus absolute. With the forceps, he gently parted the edges of the cut. Alara leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat, compelled to see the enemy they had been fighting in the dark. And then she saw it. It was not flesh. It was not muscle. It was not blood. Growing just beneath the dermal layer, intertwined with the fibrous tissue of the scar, was a network of fine, black, thread-like filaments. They were not writhing or moving in the way she had imagined. Instead, they seemed to pulse with a slow, internal rhythm, a deeply alien vitality. They looked exactly as Silas had described the vines from the marsh. Tough as wire, black as pitch, and slick with a strange, gelatinous coating that glistened in the lamplight. It was a fungus, a parasitic mycelial network that had made a home in her husband's body, spreading its tendrils through him, feeding on him. The doctor, his face a mask of intense concentration, used the tip of his scalpel to carefully sever a tiny cluster of the black threads and the tissue they were embedded in. He placed the sample onto one of the glass slides. For a moment, they both just stared into the small, clean wound at the exposed parasitic growth. The sight was grotesque, a horror of nature. But it was a known horror. It had a shape, a color, a texture. The speechless moment that followed was one of shared, stunned revelation. Dr. Finch was silent with the awe of scientific confirmation, his theory made manifest. Alara was silent with the profound, soul-shaking relief of a name being given to a demon. The crawling death under his scars was not a curse from hell, but a blight from the earth. And a blight she knew could be fought. The discovery of the fungal growth, while horrifying, was a liberation. The nameless terror that had haunted their home for months was replaced by a tangible adversary. Treatment began that very night. Dr. Finch, working with a focused intensity, cleaned the small wound and applied a potent carbolic salve. "We must attack it from both the inside and the out," he explained, his voice low but confident. He prepared a new tincture, a risky concoction containing trace amounts of mercury and iodine, substances he knew had powerful antifungal properties. It was a poison to fight a poison, a delicate and dangerous balance. The days that followed were a grueling campaign. Twice a day, Alara would have to clean Silas's arm and redress the wound, which Dr. Finch had left open to drain. Each time, she had to look upon the black, filamentous threads, a visceral reminder of the battle being waged within her husband's tissues. But she did not flinch. Her fear had been burned away, leaving behind a core of resilient determination. She administered the oral tincture with a steady hand, watching Silas for any sign of ill effect, a partner in the doctor's calculated risk. Slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to turn. The relentless, subcutaneous movement began to subside. The angry, red inflammation around the scars started to fade. The fever, which had clung to Silas for so long, finally broke one rainy afternoon, leaving him drenched in a healthy sweat. He began to take broth, then solid food. The light of awareness returned to his eyes, replacing the dull glaze of sickness and delirium. He looked at Alara, at the clean bandages on his arm, and then at Dr. Finch, who stood observing from the foot of the bed. He did not speak, but his gaze held a dawning, weary understanding. He had been to the edge of the abyss, and these two, his wife and this stranger, had refused to let him fall. The community remained distant, their judgment a wall of silence around the farm. But their power over Alara was broken. She no longer needed their approval or feared their whispers. Her world had shrunk to the confines of this cabin, to the fight for this one life, and in that narrowing, she had found a strength and a purpose that was entirely her own. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The black threads, starved and poisoned, began to recede, leaving behind clean, healing tissue. Dr. Finch's visits grew less frequent, his role shifting from that of an active commander to a watchful guardian. The black bag held less menace now, and more promise. The skeleton in his office was no longer a symbol of death, but of the knowledge that had saved a life. One crisp autumn afternoon, Silas sat on the edge of the porch, whittling a piece of wood, his hands still weak but steady. Dr. Finch's buggy was just departing, a familiar and now welcome sight. Alara stood by the doorway, drying her hands on her apron, watching her husband. He was thin, and the scars on his arm were now stark against his paler skin. But he was whole. He was hers again. The wind, the same wind that had once sounded like a dirge, now simply rustled the dry leaves, a sound of change, of seasons turning. She was no longer the frightened, helpless woman who had trembled in its grasp. She had faced the unknown, stared into the heart of a tangible horror, and had not looked away. She had found a resilience in herself she never knew she possessed, forged in the crucible of fear and faith, not faith in the unseen, but in the quiet competence of a good man, and in her own capacity to endure. She looked out over the vast plains, the endless sea of grass that had once seemed so threatening. It no longer looked empty. It looked like home, and for the first time in a very long time it felt full of hope.